Doug Whitaker hadn't even finished his coffee when the unmistakable hum of an electric golf cart rolled over the pine needle-covered path leading to his cabin. It was barely 7 o'clock a.m. and the last person he expected or wanted to see it. This was Karen Prescott. He didn't move at first, just stood on the porch, coffee in one hand, disbelief in the other. The cart jerked to a stop under his cedar awning like it belonged there. Then came the real offense. She plugged it in. No knock, no permission, just a bold, sweeping motion, like she was doing him a favor by feeding off his private power. Doug leaned on the railing. "Morning, Karen." She barely turned her head. "My cart was dying. This is urgent. You weren't answering your phone." "I don't recall giving out my number," he replied. Karen glanced at him over her sunglasses, all smugness and posture. "Well, we're neighbors now. Emergencies call for flexibility." Doug didn't answer. He didn't have to. She waved her hand like she dismissed him from his own porch and marched back toward the cart. The audacity would have been enough. But the fact that she was using his backup solar system rigged for emergencies and cold storage only was a different level of violation. That setup wasn't built to carry someone else's vehicle, and certainly not without his say. Doug turned, walked calmly into the shed behind the cabin, and flipped the switch he'd never thought he'd need again. Oxport fence trap. The label read, "A few years ago, during a long winter, a squatter had tried tapping into the outdoor port while Doug was away. He'd solved the issue not with violence, but with low-grade deterrence enough to deliver a mild zap, nothing dangerous. A simple lesson in boundaries. It took 5 minutes. Karen returned, iced coffee in one hand, reaching with the other to unplug her cart. What followed was a mix between a yelp and a startled screech, like a squirrel caught in a live wire. Doug peered through the blinds. Her cart dashboard blinked twice, then died completely. She looked around wildly, shaking her hand, dropping her cup to the gravel. Then she spotted the camera mounted on Doug's porch. Her face twisted. She knew she'd been caught on private property, without permission, and now, with a non-functioning cart and a bruised ego, Karen stormed off. Doug, still silent, returned to his coffee. The peace didn't last. An hour later, Vince Randall pulled up in his SUV. He wasn't horror royalty like Karen, but he played second chair, always eager to escalate things she started. Vince barely stepped out before raising his voice. "You wired a death trap out here, Doug. You know how this looks, right?" Doug stood on the porch like a statue. "I didn't trap anything. That's private power, clearly marked. She says you electrocuted her golf cart. Cart's not a person." "Vince, that's not the point." Doug handed him a laminated property survey, one of 3 he kept on hand. It showed the boundary line clearly, with the cabin sitting well outside the HOA jurisdiction. The utility pole marked private solar grid stood just behind the cabin. Vince squinted, read, frowned. "Still, she's rattled. Claims you've got illegal fencing wired to power. The board's going to want to investigate this." Doug shrugged. "Better bring a judge with you." It should have ended there. But Doug knew Karen. She wasn't going to admit fault. Not in 1,000 years. And from the way Vince's voice had dropped, she wasn't just embarrassed, she was spinning. Doug could see it already. Karen claiming he'd endangered her, that his unlicensed electrical rig was a threat to community safety. He figured she'd rally the board, maybe draft a cease and desist letter. But what he didn't know was that Karen had gotten her hands on something new, a drone. And that drone, equipped with a camera and funded by HOA dues, had just been approved for neighborhood enforcement. What she planned to do with it would cross far more lines than any orange extension cord ever could. Karen didn't waste time sulking. By nightfall, she was already plotting her retaliation from her deck, sipping Merlot and pacing barefoot under string lights that cost the HOA $600 to install. Her latest toy was perched in the middle of the patio, matte black quadcopter drone with high-definition thermal cameras and enough range to hover over any roof within a 2-mile radius. It wasn't technically hers. It was approved for community monitoring, pushed through the last HOA budget vote under the guise of deterring package theft. But Karen had only one target in mind: Doug Whitaker's cabin. She typed up incident report full of carefully worded half-truths. Board member assaulted by unlicensed electrified service. Suspected utility violations, non-compliant resident behavior, and a vague reference to possible wildlife endangerment. At the end, she wrote, "See attached footage." Except, she didn't have any yet. The next morning, while most residents were sipping coffee and watering flower beds, Karen launched the drone from her back deck like it was a military operation. It rose quietly, slicing through the morning air with a soft whir, and veered north toward the tree line. Doug was at the edge of his dock, untangling a fishing line. When he heard the drone, he didn't look up right away. He already knew where it came from. It hovered just above the pine canopy, holding position like it was sniffing for crime. He could feel its camera lens zooming. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He simply walked back inside. That's when Karen made her first mistake. She dipped the drone lower past the legal airspace line over private land. She zoomed in tight on Doug's shed, his roof, his solar grid. Then, in a bold stroke, she flew the drone toward the side of the cabin and paused it right outside the bedroom window. It hovered there a little too long. Doug stepped out moments later with something in his hand. It wasn't a bat. It wasn't a slingshot. It was a device shaped like a remote, covered in silver tape and built with parts from old security cameras and a car antenna. He pointed it at the drone and pressed a button. Karen's drone didn't drop, it glitched. One of the rotors buckled. The feed on her tablet pixelated, froze, then spun in a blur of trees and static. Before she could react, the drone careened sideways and slammed into a birdhouse nailed to Doug's back wall, dropping into the grass like a dead beetle. Back at Lakehurst Ridge, Karen shouted loud enough for neighbors to hear. He just shot it down. That's destruction of HOA property. Vince came jogging down the street minutes later, tablet in hand. You said you were doing a perimeter sweep. He fired some kind of weapon. I doubt it was a weapon. Karen, she shoved the tablet at him. Then explain why my drone's in the dirt. Across the lake, Doug was already placing the fallen drone inside a plastic tub marked uninvited guests. He snapped photos of the damaged camera, took a video of the crash site with today's date on the newspaper, and calmly began drafting an email to his lawyer. By noon, the neighborhood forum was exploding with posts. HOA spying on private cabins now. Why's the drone hovering over backyards? Pretty sure Karen's using our dues to fund her power trip. Doug didn't post a thing. He didn't need to. He knew Karen was unraveling herself. But what he didn't expect came later the evening, when he received a notice taped to his front gate. It was an HOA-issued citation, not for power theft, not for drone interference, but for unauthorized fencing and non-regulation electrical installations. Karen had filed a formal complaint, and now she was demanding Doug submit to a full inspection. Only problem: Doug had been keeping something buried in that shed for years, something Karen absolutely wasn't supposed to see. 2 days passed before Doug responded to the citation, not with words, but with action. He parked his pickup sideways across the entrance to his cabin's gravel path and hung a private property note, TR, A spazzing sign right on the hood. It wasn't subtle. But then again, neither was Karen. The shed in question sat 20 feet behind the cabin, just under the slope where the tree line broke. From the outside, it looked ordinary: weathered planks, rusted hinges, a faded blue door. But what lay beneath the floorboards wasn't for HOAs. Years ago, before the cabin was finished, Doug had been a subcontractor in military communication systems. Part of his job included building test environments, remote ones, and though he'd retired from government work after a messy project overseas, he'd never fully disconnected. In fact, beneath the shed was a vault, shielded, silent, and well-hidden. It wasn't illegal, but it was private, the kind of private that didn't look good under drone footage and HOA inspection forms. The citation gave him 72 hours to respond. He waited 71. Then, just before the deadline, he called Karen himself. She answered on the second ring. "Smug already? I assume you're finally ready to comply." Doug was calm. "You'll get your inspection." Karen exhaled loudly. "Good. We'll bring the forms, cameras, and our inspector. You don't get to choose who shows up." Doug paused. "Then I won't be the one letting you in," she faltered. "Excuse me, you're inspecting property outside HOA jurisdiction. Bring whoever you want, but bring a warrant too." He hung up before she could respond. Karen was fuming. She didn't want legal red tape. She wanted humiliation. She wanted Doug in front of a tribunal, or, at the very least, on the neighborhood message board, with an apology and a $500 fine. But what she got was far different. The next morning, a new post appeared online. It was from a neighbor named Greg Ballard, who lived 2 lots over. He'd posted a photo, grainy, but clear enough, of Karen's drone hovering low, directly outside the window of his 16-year-old daughter's bedroom. The comment underneath was brief. "This isn't community safety. This is surveillance." Within an hour, the post had over 40 comments and a direct message from a local journalist. By noon, Karen deleted her profile. But the damage was viral. Doug watched it unfold from his porch. Expression unreadable. His only movement was his thumb, tapping the side of an old walkie-talkie he hadn't used in years. He turned the knob and spoke one word, "Testing." There was a crackle, then a faint reply. "You still out there, Whitaker?" Doug smiled, loud and clear. That same evening, Karen, frustrated, cornered, and clearly losing control, decided to take matters into her own hands. Armed with a clipboard, a flashlight, and a pair of Vince's bolt cutters, she marched toward the cabin in full HOA uniform. No appointment, no team, no permission, just a plan to get proof, snap a few photos, and file a second report with visual confirmation. She crossed onto Doug's land just after 8:30 p.m., the sun dipping low behind the trees. The air was still. She made it to the shed, without a sound. No barking dog, no lights, no alarms. She tested the door. Locked, of course. Then, without hesitation, she crouched and began snipping the lock. Clicked. The door creaked open, just enough to let her slip inside. What she saw in the dim light wasn't anything she recognized. No gardening tools or camping gear, just a steel hatch in the floor and cables leading down into the dark. Before she could move, a loud clang echoed behind her. The door slammed shut. A red light clicked on in the ceiling. Then a voice filled the room from an old intercom. "Hope, you're not afraid of the dark, Karen." She spun around. "Doug, this isn't funny." "No," his voice replied. "It's not." Inside Doug's shed, the red light above flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Karen's breathing quickened as she pounded on the door, rattling the hinges. "This is illegal. You can't just lock me in here." Doug didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, a soft hum filled the space, followed by a slow metallic click from beneath the floor hatch. It wasn't the sound of electricity. It was the sound of something mechanical coming to life. Karen backed toward the door, flashlight in hand, sweeping the room in panic. The walls were lined with cables thick, ones bundled in neat coils, each labeled with military-style tags. One read "Sat Node for B," another simply read "Comms do not remove." She crouched beside the floor hatch, heart pounding. There were fingerprints on the handle, recent ones, and then, from the hatch itself, came the unmistakable hiss of pressurized air being released. Something was opening. Outside, Doug stood calmly by the fire pit, not 20 feet from the shed. His walkie-talkie crackled again. Uni online, perimeter active, ready for sync. Doug responded quietly. Hold position. Targets not hostile, just nosy. The voice on the other end hesitated. That's not what the motion feed says. Doug glanced toward the shed. The camera on the roof tracked a heat signature moving erratically within. Back inside, Karen yanked on the latch to the hatch, but it was no use. It was motorized, and now, the steel plate slowly lifted, revealing a set of reinforced stairs leading down into darkness. Red lights glowed along the steps, and at the bottom, a glass wall with flickering monitors. Behind it, Karen froze. It was the control room. She took one cautious step down, then another. The moment her foot hit the third step, the screen closest to her blinked to life, displaying real-time drone footage, not of her, of the neighborhood. Multiple feeds, angles from streetlights, roof corners, even under benches, all feeding into this hidden bunker beneath Doug's cabin. She whispered, "What the hell is this?" Doug's voice came through the intercom again. Calm, cold, focused. Back in 2008, I ran surveillance for joint ops in the Middle East. Small towns, big targets. When I retired, I brought the blueprint with me, just in case the wrong kind of neighbors ever moved in. Karen turned toward the glass. Her own face was now on one of the screens. This is a violation of at least 5 federal codes, she shouted. Doug chuckled. So was flying a drone into a civilian's bedroom window. But you didn't seem too worried about that. Karen bolted up the stairs, but the hatch closed with a slam, locked, sealed. The lights dimmed. The only glow came from the monitors, each displaying footage of her storming through the neighborhood over the past few months. Every complaint, every confrontation, every role she had bent and twisted. She suddenly felt very small in that bunker, very exposed. Then, from the far monitor, another screen lit up. This one was different. It showed a live image of Vince, her right-hand man, standing by her house, talking to a city code officer. Karen squinted. She could barely hear them. But the city official was holding a folder. He looked annoyed. Vince was pointing toward the lake. And then he shook his head. Whatever story Karen had fed him, Vince wasn't backing it anymore. Doug's voice returned one last time. Vince reached out to me last night. Turns out he's tired of being your cleanup crew. And he shared a little secret I thought you'd appreciate. Karen swallowed. You remember the HOA funds from last quarter? The budget line item labeled Community Infrastructure Maintenance. She remembered it well. It was the one she'd reallocated without a vote. A little off the top to pay for the drone. Some of it spent on new patio lighting. She figured no one would notice. Turns out, it wasn't just a gray area, it was wire fraud. Vince kept receipts. The light in the room turned from red to white. The hatch above slowly began to open again. Doug's voice faded. You've got 10 minutes before the city official shows up. I suggest you fix your story before they ask why you were breaking into a locked shed with bolt cutters." Karen didn't speak. She just stood there, lips trembling, hair a mess, facing a screen that had her entire reign on digital record. And in that moment, for the first time in her long, tyrannical HOA career, she didn't have a comeback. Karen sat silently in the bunker beneath Doug's cabin, the glow of the surveillance monitors illuminating the weariness on her face. For the first time, the armor of authority that had protected her in the HOA meetings and community gatherings seemed brittle, cracked by the weight of exposed secrets. She could almost hear the ticking clock counting down the minutes before the city officials arrived outside. Vince Randall paced nervously near the edge of Karen's driveway, the folder of evidence weighing heavily in his hands. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a cautious resolve that made him seem smaller than usual. "Karen's really gone too far this time," he muttered, speaking into his phone. "No way she can talk her way out of this one." Unbeknownst to Karen, Vince had been keeping his own list of grievances for months. He'd grown tired of Karen's bullying and reckless misuse of HOA funds. He knew exposing her was risky, but if he didn't act soon, he'd be dragged down with her. Inside the bunker, Karen's thoughts raced. Her mind flashed back to all the times she'd gotten away with things, the arbitrary fines, the secret meetings, the covert surveillance operations. But this was different. This was personal. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed Vince's number. After a few rings, he answered. Voice clipped. "Vince, listen." "No," he interrupted. "There's nothing to listen to. I've already forwarded everything to the city. You can't hide this time." Karen's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "You don't have to do this. We can fix it. I'll step down." "Whatever you want." Vince's sigh was heavy. "It's too late for that. The neighborhood's already talking. People want change." Meanwhile, Doug, who had been watching the entire scene unfold through the bunker's security feeds, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, he thought, wasn't always about laws. It was about holding people accountable. The first headlights of the city code enforcement vehicle appeared at the end of Karen Street. Karen, still trapped in the bunker, slammed her fist against the glass wall, frustration boiling over. "Vince, if you think this is over, you're wrong. I'll make sure you regret this." But Vince was already stepping into the car, determined to make things right. Back in the neighborhood, whispers spread like wildfire. Karen's power was slipping. Neighbors who had once feared her now dared to speak openly. Doug stepped outside his cabin, taking a deep breath of fresh lake air. The battle wasn't over. But tonight, he felt the tide turning. As dusk settled over Lakehurst Ridge, Karen Prescott sat in her dimly lit living room, the weight of recent events pressing on her like a storm cloud. The city officials were circling. Vince had turned against her, and Doug's digital fortress beneath his cabin threatened to expose everything she had fought so hard to hide. But Karen wasn't one to fold quietly. She opened a hidden drawer and pulled out a small enveloper, carefully prepared package containing forged documents, false affidavits, and a list of supposed irregularities about Doug's cabin. She had been crafting this backup plan for months, anticipating a moment just like this. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the HOA lawyer's number. "It's time to take this to the next level," she whispered, voice steely. Across town, Doug's phone buzzed. A message popped up from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game. Back off or face consequences." Doug frowned, but didn't reply. He'd faced threats before. This one just sounded desperate. The next morning, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting at the community center. Chairs scrape on linoleum floors. Neighbors whispered anxiously, and tension thickened the air. Karen stood at the front, rehearsing her lines like a seasoned actor. She launched into her presentation, brandishing the forged papers with a flourish. These documents prove Mr. Whitaker's cabin violates multiple safety codes, including unauthorized electrical work and unpermitted construction. Gasps rippled through the room. Some homeowners shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Doug stepped forward calmly. Those documents are fabricated. I have every permit and inspection record, filed and approved by the county. Karen's smile faltered. She'd expected pushback, but not this level of certainty. Just then, Vince entered the room, holding up a folder of his own. I have something to add, he announced. These are internal HOA records showing unauthorized spending money that went toward a surveillance drone and personal projects, not community improvements. The room erupted into murmurs. Karen's face flushed with anger. Before she could respond, Doug held up his phone, playing a video message recorded earlier that day by a neighborhood resident. In it, the resident described hearing strange noises and seeing shadows near Karen's property, suggesting she was manipulating evidence and intimidating neighbors. The evidence was mounting against Karen. Her grip on the community was slipping fast. Feeling the walls closing in, Karen made a bold move. She stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. Outside, Doug followed at a distance, wary but curious. Karen's car was parked by the lake, engine running. As she revved it, Doug heard her mutter, "If I'm going down, I'm taking them all with me." Suddenly, the headlights blinded him as she sped toward the dock. Without hesitation, Doug sprinted after her, adrenaline pumping. At the dock's edge, Karen swerved sharply and aimed straight for the water. Doug dove just in time, grabbing the open door and pulling her back. They both tumbled onto the wetwood, gasping for breath. Karen glared at him. "This isn't over." Doug helped her up, shaking his head. "It is if you stop this now." Nearby neighbors had gathered. Drawn by the commotion, their eyes were wide with shock, some reaching for their phones. Doug glanced at the crowd, and then at Karen. For the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. As the police sirens approached, Doug raised his voice. "Neighbors, this is what happens when power is abused. Let's make sure it never happens again." The flashing red and blue lights painted the lake's surface as police cars arrived, neighbors murmuring anxiously around the dock. Doug stood nearby, his jacket damp from the evening's chase, but his mind racing faster than ever. As officers approached Karen, she suddenly dropped her tough weight. The confident, domineering HOA president crumbled into something fragile, barely recognizable. One of the officers stepped forward. "Karen Prescott, you're under investigation for fraud, trespassing, and now reckless endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." Karen nodded numbly but didn't resist. Doug noticed her eyes dart toward him, searching. Later that night, Doug sat alone on his porch, the quiet lake reflecting the moon's silver glow. The community was shaken. But the real shock was still to come. The next morning, a call came from the county records office. Doug's heart sank as he listened. "There's been an update on the property line disputes," the clerk said. "Apparently, your deed wasn't as clear-cut as you thought." Doug frowned. "What do you mean?" The clerk hesitated. "Turns out, the parcel your cabin sits on overlaps partially with HOA land by nearly an acre. The deed, recorded 10 years ago, had a clerical error." Doug's mind spun. That meant Karen had been right about one thing. Before Doug could digest this, his phone rang again, this time from Vince. "You need to see this." Vince said, voice low and urgent. Doug met Vince at a local diner. Vince slid a folder across the table. Inside were old emails, HOA board minutes, and legal documents. Among them was an email chain revealing Karen's family connection to the developer who'd drawn the original HOA boundaries that weren't just disputed but deliberately shifted to favor her family's interests. Doug stared. So, all along, she wasn't just bullying the neighborhood. She was protecting her family's hidden stake. Vince nodded grimly. And when you started pushing back, she saw you as a threat to that legacy. Doug rubbed his temples. The fight wasn't just about a power cord or a drone. It was about deep-rooted control. But then Vince pulled out one last document-signed confession Karen had made during a private HOA board meeting, admitting to falsifying the drone budget and illegally surveilling neighbors to maintain dominance. Doug felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion. Later that evening, Doug decided to confront Karen one last time, not with anger, but with facts. He found her at the local coffee shop, as tired but defiant. Karen, he said quietly, it's over, the truth is out. She looked up, a flicker of something softer in her gaze. Maybe it is. Doug sighed. You don't have to keep fighting. You can still fix this. Karen nodded slowly, tears threatening to spill. I lost sight of why I started, trying to protect this community. But maybe it's time to let go. Doug smiled faintly. That's the first smart move you've made in a long time. Outside, neighbors watched from a distance, hopeful that after years of tension, the real healing might finally begin. The sun had barely risen over Lakehurst Ridge when Doug Whitaker received an unexpected call from Karen Prescott. After everything, the drone drummer, the legal battles, the community upheaval, this was a moment he hadn't anticipated. I want to meet, she said quietly, her voice carrying a hint of vulnerability. Doug agreed. They met at the neighborhood park, where the old picnic tables had seen years of horrid debates and, lately, heated arguments. Karen looked around, as if searching for an escape. But then she met Doug's eyes. I've been thinking, she began. Maybe I went about all this the wrong way. Maybe there's a better way to serve the community. Doug nodded, the weight of months' worth of conflict slowly lifting. You're right. It's not about control, it's about trust. They talked for hours, hashing out a plan to rebuild the community's fractured trust. Karen agreed to step down as HOA president and to cooperate fully with investigations into the budget misappropriations. She even suggested forming a neighborhood committee, including Doug and Vince, to oversee transparency and communication moving forward. The news spread quickly. Neighbors who had been wary began to hope, but just when it seemed peace was finally within reach, a local reporter showed up at Doug's doorstep with a curious question. Have you seen the new zoning proposal that just passed? Doug frowned and took the thick envelope the reporter handed him. Inside was a notice from the county, an urgent reminder that the disputed land wasn't the only issue. The developer Karen's family had ties to was now planning to build a large commercial complex on the edge of the lake, threatening the very serenity everyone had fought to protect. Doug's jaw tightened. This wasn't over. Later that evening, Doug stood by his cabin's dock, looking out over the water shimmering under the moonlight. He pulled out his phone and dialed Vince. We need to get ahead of this, Doug said. If the developer thinks they can steamroll the neighborhood, they're wrong. Vince's voice crackled through the speaker. Agreed. But this time, we play it smart. Doug smiled grimly. And no more surprises. As the screen faded to black, the narrator's voice returned calm, but with a knowing edge. In Lakehurst Ridge, peace is fragile. Power can shift with the wind. But sometimes, the strongest community is the one that fights together, even when the fight isn't over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done if you were Doug? And stay tuned because in Horror Wars, the next chapter is never far away.